Hey, my name is Sahas. I debated for Ananda. I was part of the national team in 2018, and I'm currently the coach of Hillwood College Kandy. Today, kind of breaking down the motion, this house believes that enlightened despotism is superior to democracy. There is an Infoslide which says enlightened despotism refers to a form of absolute rule where a monarch or leader governs with the principles of the Enlightenment, such as reason, tolerance, and reform. So, this actually quite reminds me of a motion previously, which I used to debate while I was in school, which is this house prefers a benevolent dictatorship over a corrupt democracy. I think this obviously on opposition is a bit harder to defend a corrupt democracy, but really, in my opinion, this is the burden of proof here is ultimately to kind of juxtapose one or the other, regardless of what side you are on. And really, it's in my opinion just a this house prefers motion in disguise. So there's a few pushes that I think the proposition can make. One is that I think proposition should basically strategically kind of muddy the definition of democracy. There's one of two ways that you can muddy the definition of democracy. One is you can basically make it akin to idiocracy, which is to say the it's tyranny of the misinformed. That is to say that people are generally stupid. And then you also have this idea of like demagoguery, which means that politicals are used to kind of manipulating and appealing to people's emotions. There's also an interesting argument that I would recommend you guys check out on called Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky on YouTube. And also on extension on that, this is I think a lot of people tend to use this argument in the local circuit, that is to basically make the argument about how democracy is all about populist political parties that are just like promising people the sun and the moon. But yeah, that's what I would probably start off with by trying to kind of make sure democracy, because opposition is probably going to give me all the bells and whistles of democracy about like how you vote for your future, how you change your future and all that. But honestly, the more you kind of like take a shot at democracy, I think the benefit it's in the benefit of the proposition to do so. uh, and now that that's the case, I would also go on to explain voter dynamics. That is to say, the main participant of democracy is obviously being the voters. I would argue about how individual, like voters, tend to be more often than not selfish. That is to say that voters only would vote for things that would affect themselves or the immediate family. If so, that is to say, like people tend to like vote for someone who says that they'll give him a job, or vote for someone who has given their dad a job, or something like that, or an extension about one particular issue that they are very passionate about. So, for example, in the presidential election in the United States, maybe a majority of Kamala voters either voted one of two reasons. One is because they really cared a lot about reproductive rights. Secondly, they cared about not Trump winning. So a lot of people tend to like vote based on very single sort of issues, and also even if it's not single issues, it's probably more or less say kind of like selfish single issues. Uh, this is also why you also tend to have like in countries with like pre-existing like class dynamics and like ill access to opportunities, you have like people who have like party loyalties because like like back in the day somebody gave them a job, therefore they're still loyal to that party even if it's being loyal to a fault. And also on extension on that, I would probably talk about how like the dynamics of democracy are really set up for failure. There's a few levels of analysis under this. Well, three mainly. One is that I would argue to say that people are more likely to be strung on, because democracy is really not about getting things done, but rather promising something that is going to be happening in the future. So more often than not, political parties have very vague sort of definitional promises that they tend to do when it comes to these things. Now, for example, even the previous government that came in Sri Lanka is like, oh, we're going to catch the thieves. Or rather, for example, Trump wants to make America great again, or making Sri Lanka a developed country. So these are things that are very hard to metrify and hard to prove that you have done at the end of the day. So more often than not, politics in itself is really just a sort of like a theater of sorts when it comes to stringing people on. Now, opposition might be able to argue that if you aren't really promising on your deliverables, you more often than not will get swapped out, and that's really where the next harm kind of comes in. Is because that people often tend to like vote for the complete opposite of the party. That is to say, the floating vote tends to vote for the other guy. Uh, After like one or two terms, if like for example they feel like the promises are made, which means that one of two things. One, it means that you can't really have any long-term sort of goals at the end of the day, because if something isn't able to be rectified at the end of like a particular term, chances are you're not getting elected ever again. And on extension on that, it also means that more often than not, like people tend to swap governments like they swap, I don't know, something else, because at the end of the day you don't really have any sort of like long term sort of benefits or long term kind of like developments or whatever, because more often than not progression also isn't really measured when governments change in the same sort of one directional way, because more often than not governments that come in or step in as opposed to some previous government that was there, more often than not, what ends up happening is that they tend to kind of not finish any sort of projects that initially happened, or claim there was like corruption or whatever. The chances are they're probably worse. but they won't probably finish it, mainly because if they do finish a project, they often can't get credit for it. And again, this kind of links back to my earlier idea that that politics is more or less theater for the misinformed as opposed to actually getting things done. And also, on extension on that, you could also probably argue that this just leads to like this just leads to, again, like as you initially mentioned, that this just leads to like people pleasing and stuff like that, as opposed to actually getting stuff done. And this also means that if, especially in like populist governments, that you have desperate political parties more often than not using minorities, so like people with less political capital as scapegoats, because they aren't useful as voters, so might as well just make them the enemy and try to rally people around you. And I think this is also something, if you take a look at like manufacturing consent, you would also like notice this argument is something that's like kind of based out of there. Now, you can't just like obviously run an exclusive negative case here. You also need to have like a few counterfactual points on your end. So I think it's very important in this debate for you guys to link it back to the motion that you've been given, where you say, oh, the motion itself says reason, tolerance, and reform. This gives us one of two things. One is that you kind of have to concede that there might be some amount of pre-existing bias on what reason, tolerance, and reform looks like, but it is highly unlikely that reason, tolerance, and reform, as like a third party observer to this debate, looks like something like someone killing someone and is like being like, oh, okay, I did it because I love that person, therefore I thought it was just to kill them off. Obviously, that probably wouldn't fall under the this thing. And when I mean obviously for prop, it's not very obvious for op because they'll be arguing the counterfactual. But you can make the claim to say that it's really hard to claim that a delusional, like, genocidal maniac is really someone you will have to defend within the scope of the motion. So you try to, like, not brush away that sort of stuff. And then the second point that kind of falls under this is that because there is no constant desire for good optics, it means that you can create long-term projects and long-term plans, and you're more likely to be sympathetic towards minorities, which is probably going to be the most vulnerable sort of stakeholder on your side of the debate, because you're also claiming that, if you have like populist governments, you obviously, it comes at the cost of like minorities. Why is this the case? Because you could make the argument to say that, especially in a country like Sri Lanka, governments are less likely to work with the north and the east, mainly because they realize that if they, like, give any amount of like devolved government statehood to people of the north and the east, you have a bunch of like Sinhalese people accusing the government of, like, backstabbing or betraying the war and all the soldiers who died for the war. So it's less likely that a government that has to care about optics is more likely to work with minorities and like people who would be considered as scapegoats, because there's always going to be people who are going to be using that as advantage or ammunition. Even if the government itself isn't actively participating in such desperate tactics, there's always going to be people who are participating in desperate tactics, which means that the misinformed public will more likely sway towards that side, which is just unfortunately something you just have to deal with. So if that sort of situation, if you're like a dictator, you really, the benefit of you not caring about public perception is that you genuinely don't have to care about public perception, and you can do really good things if you want to. And that's kind of the benefit that you're probably running on proposition side. Now, that being said, what really is the opposition's path to victory, right? I think opposition's path to victory is really for them to explain to me why the reform, the recent tolerance reform thing that's in the info slide itself, is why it's really just a value judgment call that you're making at the end of the day. Why is this the case? Because you could make the argument to say that people historically have been looking at things like, recent tolerance and reform, and they've been doing historically bad things. For example, what exactly does constitute as like reason, tolerance, and reform, right? I would argue this would be whatever values that you were brought up with, which means that it's probably going to be like based off religion or whatever. So religion obviously is influenced by society, and religion also influences society. It's one of both, it goes both ways. But that being said, you could have really one of 2 points under this, right? One is that, like, as examples, for example, like historically the Bible has justified things like slavery, saying that, oh, these guys don't like fall under this category. So it would still be in the view of the reasoning to be like, oh, it's okay to, like, commit harm, so, like, do whatever you want to these group of people, solely because they don't, like, fall under this category. And that's really the problem here as well. Like, the idea of the reason is really just a subjective opinion of whatever people want to. For example, you could also make the argument to say that it might be justice, so it might be just to basically kill off queer people because, you prevent them from living lives of sin or whatever. You try to force them into some sort of, like, chemical sort of like therapy or whatever that isn't really going to be like beneficial to them, and it's going to be harmful, but because you're trying to, like, salvage them or save them, which is again like some sort of value judgment that you kind of impose on other people, which isn't really a fair thing to do, and also not a nice thing to do. And on top of that, I think on so yeah so on Also, on extension on that, you basically can prove this argument to say that it is more likely that a dictator is probably going to be problematic solely because historical, patterns haven't been really nice towards dictators. I guess the only one that I can think of off the top of my head that was considered to be good was probably Lee Kuan Yew, which is the first prime minister of Singapore. And I think there was someone in Turkey who was apparently quite liberal or nice. Or was it Iran? I'm not quite sure, but yeah, I'm sure you guys can figure out who it is. And then obviously, the main accusation that they have leverage against you is obviously the majority rule thing, right? So this is something that you'll have to deal with regardless. I think the majority rule thing is really part and parcel of poorly designed democracies, and it's not really something that you should be defending. Obviously, opposition might be able to like bite the bullet and be like, you know what, it's fine as long as the majority of people are happy, then there's a majority utility there at the end of the day. I think that's a bit of a rough argument to run. I mean, you could run, depending on like how skilled your opponents are. But regardless, I think what's probably smarter for you to do is basically just argue about how democracy isn't really about just voting, but rather democracy is about representation. So that means if minorities, for example, if minority parties in a political system don't have enough representation to leverage any amount of their rights, that means they don't have representation, which means that it is not really democratic, therefore not within the scope of your debate to defend that sort of things. So what really are you defending? I think you're probably defending things like electoral college systems where you have like relatively some amount of equal representation because of the way in which the electorals are kind of drawn out, but that also depends on how the electorals are drawn out. And about like how minority groups often also have some amount of power where they're kind of needed, and you don't have one political party dominating in one complete area, which means that these guys will also have to form like coalition governments and stuff like that, right? And you can flip the selfish minded or the selfish minded and the single minded argument to your side and basically make the argument to say that although you could probably concede that people might have like a single minded reason of sending someone to political like parliament, and like maybe it's just like one particular thing, because now political parties are in such a way where they're equally represented, or like these big groups still have some more representation. You can't just like high road all of them. More often than not, what happens is that they'll often be forced to politics among themselves and basically come to a compromise and get their deals done, which means that at the end of the day, you have a majority of people getting whatever representation they want. And obviously, there's going to be an argument about like accountability checking mechanism and why that's good and why having like supreme power over something isn't really good, because at the end of the day, you need to have these sort of things. And even if, like, for example, you buy into the narrative that there's going to be like long-term developments, you could probably make the argument to say that because it's probably going to be a dictator and there's not going to be any amount of consulting that's going to happen, it's probably going to just end up being like white elephant projects that really don't do much and don't matter at all, and they just do whatever they want. And because they aren't really receptive towards the public opinion, they often also means that they are kind of out of touch and they don't really care about what's happening at the end of the day. So I guess that's really what the breakdown of the motion is. There's obviously going to be a few things that I might have missed, but yeah. So that's what I think about the motion, and that's just a breakdown of what's the motion again. This house believes that enlightened despotism is superior to democracy. Thanks for listening.